So what we have discovered so far in this course is that chemistry is really all about electrons. When electrons come together, that's what actually creates bonds. Now, why do electrons come together? Well, one way we could say is they're trying to achieve the lowest energy level. So that's why they come together. Another reason they come together is because they're trying to fill their orbits with the correct number of electrons. For most of the electrons, we're really thinking about 8. So for most of these atoms, we're going to obey the octet rule. They're trying to get rings of 8. One of the exceptions, of course, is hydrogen, and hydrogen is trying to get a ring of 2, and that's because it's at a much lower place on the periodic table. So when two electrons come together, we call this a bond. And so let's take a look here. So in this example here, I have hydrogen chloride. So we have two atoms, hydrogen and chloride, right? So we'll look at this guy right here. And hydrogen has 1 electron and chloride has 7. So this would be the 1 from hydrogen. And these are the 7 from chloride. Comes together, forms a ring of 8. That's what chloride wants. Forms a ring of 2. That's what hydrogen wants. And so these 2 electrons right here are the ones they're sharing or coming together. And that would create a bond. And we indicate those 2 electrons as a line like this. So actually there are other electrons out here, but we're not going to include them. They're just simply implied. So we'll just erase those. What we're interested in is just this guy right here. That's going to indicate that there's 2 electrons that formed a bond. So when 2 electrons connect 2 atoms, that's what we call a bond, and we're indicating it by a line. Now, there's 2 different ways that electrons can come together to form bonds. One is the one we studied in our last unit. That was ionic bonds, right? And ionic bonds means that one of them really wants to gain electrons and one of them really wants to lose electrons. So it's a funny way. So for example, in sodium chloride, sodium really wanted to lose an electron, chloride really wanted to gain one. And we talked about this in terms of our octet rule by either an atom wanting to get to 8 to look like a noble gas, or wanting to get to 0, losing, to look like a noble gas. So if you look at the periodic table, this sort of makes sense. So if they gain or lose, we call this an ionic bond. What we're going to talk about in this unit is a different way they could do it, which is covalent bonds. And in this type, there's no particular atom that wants to really lose or gain electrons. They're not quite as strong about it. And so what they want to do is they want to share them. They want to share the electrons, okay? And sharing means covalent. So they're sharing valence electrons. So we would call this a covalent bond. Now, how do we recognize whether it's covalent or ionic? Well, a simple way to do it is if you look at the periodic table there, if you find that the 2 atoms involved are far apart, they probably form ionic bonds. And the reason is if they're far apart, one of them clearly wants to lose electrons and one of them clearly wants to gain electrons. However, if the elements are fairly close together on the periodic table, nobody is really strongly desiring to lose or gain an electron. Therefore, they probably share them and form covalent bonds. Let's look at some examples. So let's look at sodium and chloride. Now, sodium is way off on the left side of the table, and chloride is way off on the right side. Sodium definitely wants to lose 1 electron to look like a noble gas. Chlorine wants to gain 1 electron to look like a noble gas. And so they come together to form a nice molecule like this, sodium chloride. There's our bond. And this is probably sodium chloride. It's an ionic molecule. However, what if we look at 2 atoms which are fairly close together, carbon and oxygen? They're right beside each other. Well, they got nitrogen in between, but pretty close. They want to form a covalent bond because carbon doesn't really want to lose electrons all that much, and oxygen doesn't really want to gain them. So they come together, form a covalent compound, which we call carbon dioxide. What do we know about ionic bonds and covalent bonds? Well, ionic bonds are fairly weak bonds. So when you put things in water, they kind of fall apart right away. A really good example is salt, which we know is the last molecule we talked about, sodium chloride. So the minute you put that in water, it kind of falls apart into sodium and chloride, right? It's not a very strong bond. Covalent bonds tend to be pretty strong, so most of the biological molecules we'll talk about later in this class are probably covalent bonds, so organic molecules. How about sugar, right? If you go ahead and take sugar and put it into water, it dissolves, but it pretty much stays together as a sugar molecule. Okay? So let's go ahead and practice these molecules today.